there's a lot of crossover. There was the story of a campaign. This is a post-nomination, pre-election meeting that Donald Trump Jr., that Eric Prince, that representatives of the Saudis and the UAE, and an Israeli social media guy came in to offer the Trump campaign all sorts of assistance to win their election. Then we jump ahead and we are months after the election. And we have, and I should say in that first meeting, there was a guy named Nader, who was sort of, I guess, a fixer of sorts, I guess you could call him. Nader shows back up. He's also there with Elliot Broidy. They're there with Jared Kushner, the Saudis, the UAE, and they are now talking about isolating Qatar. And there's a quality of quid pro quo here, and the quid being help with the campaign, and then the quo coming in the form of, yeah, let's try and isolate Qatar. And that would involve a significant amount of change in U.S. policy, because Qatar actually has a base. And at least in that narrow region, the United States had tried to sort of walk the line here. So take it from there. What follows? And tell us more. We were just about to introduce the idea of this guy Broidy, who stood to gain $1 billion in contracts, he and Nader, from lobbying on behalf of the Saudis and the UAE. But Broidy then shows up in a rather tangential way. Walk us through that again.
Well, Broidy, who, they've been trying to sell this idea of the, of United States changing policy with respect to Qatar on behalf of the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And he and Nader have been going back and forth. There's this major $1 billion consulting contract or series of consulting contracts in the offing if they're able to convince the two countries that they can make this happen. And Broidy's, one of his main selling points is that he has personal access to the president himself. He shows up at Mar-a-Lago on December 2nd, 2017, and he has a meeting with the president. 2 days later, or I shouldn't say 2 days later, a couple of days later, 2 or 3 days later, this $600 million contract with more to come comes through miraculously for Broidy and Nader. As it happens, 2 days before that Mar-a-Lago meeting, Elliot Broidy had completed a non-disclosure agreement along the lines of Stormy Daniels with exactly the same lawyers involved, Michael Cohen, this guy, what was his name, Keith Davidson, who also represented Stormy Daniels, and Karen McDougal, the other woman that Trump had paid off. And he had completed a deal to pay $1.6 million to this woman, this former Playboy playmate, who was supposedly his mistress. And all that had been done in secret. Then he goes to Mar-a-Lago, meets Donald Trump, and several days later, this big $1 billion contract comes through. So the speculation has been, before we ever knew anything about the $600 billion contract, or $600 million contract, before we knew anything about, any of the stuff that was going on with George Nader and Elliot Broidy and the UAE and Saudi Arabia, we knew that there was something very fishy about this payment that Elliot Broidy agreed to make for this Playboy playmate mistress, alleged mistress of his. When it was revealed that it had happened, he very calmly just admitted it and said, yeah, I did it. She got pregnant, she had an abortion, right. I paid $1.6 million, blah, blah, blah. As it turns out, Broidy has paid off mistresses for politicians in the past. This is something that he does, number one. Number two, this woman fits the profile in every way of a Donald Trump mistress, right? I mean, this is
she looks like Ivanka.
Looks like Ivanka, and it's the same people involved, the same lawyers involved. Everything about it just looks exactly like a Stormy Daniels kind of situation, right? And, but nobody could figure out, why would Broidy do this? I mean, $1.6 million, that's not nothing, right? I mean, that's real money. Why would he pay that off for Donald Trump just because? I mean, you might like the guy, but they didn't have like a long-term relationship or something. He wasn't someone who would do such a thing just out of the goodness of his heart. This news that came through in the AP kind of makes things look a little bit clearer. That perhaps Broidy...
potential motive.
Exactly. Why would Broidy do it? Well, there was a nearly $1 billion contract in the offing. If he could help out Donald Trump in something that Donald Trump definitely did not want to get out. I mean, this was, this featured an abortion. I mean, this is something that might even upset 2 or 3 of his evangelical followers. Doubtful, but, it might happen.
Let me offer just an alternate theory as to why Donald Trump doesn't want this out. Money. Because I'm not convinced, frankly, there's anything he could do that would cost him support. However, I would be very surprised if there was not some very specific provisions in the prenup with him and Melania that involved such public disclosures of infidelity. And I imagine it was rather legalistic. I imagine there was a very sort of like specific bar as to what would trigger some major alimony payments. And I suspect that's what was going on there.
Yeah, I think you're right. You've kind of held that from the beginning on the whole Stormy Daniels thing, and it really is the one thing that makes the most sense on how, why did he care? Why would he bother? I mean, this seems like everybody always says, it was baked in after the Access Hollywood tape and all that stuff. But this, and even Melania even defended him after the Access Hollywood tape. You remember, she said, this is boys talk,
Right.
So, who knows what's going on with their relationship, but that does make sense that there's some serious money involved if it turns out that he had been, paying off mistresses during his marriage to Melania. And here we have, a potential, it's kind of like a double quid pro quo, right? I mean, they came to Trump back during the campaign and tried to get Trump Jr. on board with their plan for the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Then after the election, they moved forward with this plan to change the government policy about it. And they did partially change the government policy. Yep. It did partially work. And then, the way that Broidy was making this happen was through his relationship with Donald Trump, which, nobody really, what would that be? What was his relationship with him? Well, you get back to Michael Cohen and you get back to all of that, and it starts to look very much as if this whole business of this Middle Eastern, fixers, as you put it, come to Stormy Daniels.
Yep, there's a pay-to-play quality about this administration that seems to be agnostic as to the country. And I just want to say before we take a break, when you hear Rudy Giuliani going out there talking about trying to negotiate with Mueller in public as to what Donald Trump can discuss, Rudy Giuliani is happy to have him discuss what happens during the campaign. He doesn't want the stuff to be discussed that happens once he becomes president, because the quid pro quo reaches over the election. So the quid is before the election and the quo is after the election. And if you can just focus the investigation on before the election, you never can prove the quo, because that happens afterwards. All right, look, we've got a lot of other stuff to talk about. Let's take a quick break. I'll be right back. More with Heather Parton or Digby. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio.